Hi, I'm Russell Eyrig from the Cincinnati Art Museum, and today I wanted to share with you some ink drawing techniques. So a while ago, I made a post letting everyone know about the Inktober Challenge. That's when artists try to make and post an ink drawing every day in October. So I wanted to show you some ways of working with ink because it can be a little intimidating. Now, there are a lot of different tools you can use to get ink onto a page. Of course, you can always use cheaper materials like a standard ballpoint pen, but of course there's nicer pens and markers that you can also use. Of course, you can also go really old school and just use a brush or a nib pen with a bottle of ink. A lot of times cheaper materials, like a ballpoint pen, are not archival, which means they're going to fade a lot faster than nicer inks, especially when exposed to sunlight or other light. So obviously ink is permanent, so it's probably a good idea to start with a light pencil drawing before you commit to ink. Now, line weight is another important thing to understand when working with ink. That just means how thick or thin a line is. And line weight can be used in a lot of different ways. Obviously, thicker lines tend to stand out more, so often artists use those to bring more attention to the main subject. You'll notice in comic art, a lot of the bodies are outlined with thick lines, while thinner lines make up the smaller details. A lot of times, thicker lines can suggest shadow or even weight, so it also makes sense to put thicker lines at the bottom of objects. If you're using a brush, you can use pressure to create thicker lines. And with markers, you usually just adjust the angle of the marker to change your line weight. Another challenge with ink is creating value or tone. That just means how light or dark something is. If you're used to working with graphite, you know you can just press harder or softer to adjust your value. But ink is just black. There's no pressing harder or softer to make it lighter or darker. So you're gonna need some different tricks to create value. One of those is hatching and cross-hatching. Hatching is when you use parallel lines to create a sense of value or tone to the drawing. When those lines cross, it's called cross-hatching. Making those lines follow the form of the object will help create roundness in your drawing. The closer the lines, the darker the area appears. To bring it back to line weight, I like to do my cross-hatching with a much thinner line than I'm using to define the main object. Stippling is a similar idea, but instead you're using dots. The closer the dots are to each other, the darker the area. This is basically how an inkjet printer works, but with very, very tiny dots and computerized precision. Now, if you're using a bottle of ink, you can also water down your ink and use washes to paint like watercolor. The more water you add, the lighter the ink. And you can always apply it in layers. If you leave it wet, you'll get some cool but unpredictable bleeding, or you can let it dry for a more controlled effect. A lot of times I look for lines that already exist and just draw more or less of them to create value. For instance, imagine hair. You don't need to draw every single hair on a person's head, but by strategically drawing some of them, you can create the sense of a full head of hair with shadows. So I hope these tips were helpful for you, and I hope you can enjoy making some ink drawings and even share some of them here in the comments.